and the SGC colleagues for hosting this meeting and for supporting this project over the past few years. I'm the PI on the project, but did not do this in any way, shape, or form alone. And on the call, you've got a few of the key colleagues in-house. Katie Peterson, you're going to hear from her in a minute, and also Spencer Cole and Saira Joaquin Morales, and also, although she's not an author of any of the reports, Vida Terrani, who is our grants manager and a very key person in making this all come together. And so, Katie, do you want to maybe share the slides, and we can use those just as a way to kind of support what I'm going to give you as a little intro, and then hand it over to Katie.
All right. That's the one we want.
Here we go. Okay. So this slide also kind of just summarizes for you the funders for this project. We were really fortunate once we got the award from the Strategic Growth Council under this program, that sort of enabled us to leverage some additional support from some other funders, including at the state level. We're part of a CDFA grant looking at drought, and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has been a part of the support for this. USDA has supported this through a couple of grants, including one on Secure Water Future that is run out of UC Merced. And then the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy has a center based in Arizona called the Babbitt Center for Land and Water Policy, which thought that this work was really important and interesting. So thank you for helping us also leverage additional funding, SGC. So, okay, let's go on to the next. So this is the full project team from within PPIC that has worked on various aspects of the project over the last 4 years. And many of them appear on more than one report out of the projects that we did. Okay, we'll go on to the next now. We also did this with a lot of partnership with other folks from other organizations. So our convening partners for this work included longtime colleagues from Fresno State's California Water Institute, Laura Ramos and Sarge Green, but then also our community, our sort of official community partner in this project was the Central Valley Community Foundation, which has been doing a lot of great work to catalyze folks across the region on economic development and equity issues. So initially, Sarah Moffett from that team was our key partner, and now Christina Solberg. And then we brought in experts on a number of the different topics that we're going to run through the findings of, but just to kind of name them now. We did a piece on solar energy in the Valley, working together with folks from CEA Consulting. You see the folks named here, and then a couple of other consultants from other teams. On air quality, and an air quality expert named Jamin Kwan, professor at Fresno State. On dryland cropping or water limited cropping, a couple of experts from UC Cooperative Extension and UC Davis faculty, Mark Lundy and Cameron Piddlecow. And then on economic scenarios, UC Merced, longtime partner Jose Medina Zuara. And then on habitat, we got really great input from Abby Hart at the Nature Conservancy, who's been involved in these issues in the Valley for some time. So, okay, next slide. And just a little bit of sort of the background, and Diana mentioned sort of what the issues were that you were interested in with this third call. And that announcement of the third call came at a time when we had just wrapped up some significant work looking at the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in the San Joaquin Valley, which is kind of ground zero for the implementation of this act, because it's the state's largest ag region, and it's kind of the place where it's kind of groundwater overdraft central, in a way where there have been decades of overdraft or excess pumping of groundwater, and during the drought of the mid 2010s, things really started to come to a head with a lot of wells going dry, a lot of accelerated land subsidence, and so that was in some ways the catalyst for this law being passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in late 2014. So we kind of started taking a closer look at issues in the Valley starting in 2016, and had published several reports looking at various aspects of this. And in 2019, a kind of big comprehensive picture on looking at the water supply and quality challenges that the region was facing. And what we estimated in that context was that probably at least 500,000 acres were going to need to come out of production as part of bringing basins into balance. That even though this region folks are very motivated to find new supplies to help bring their basins into balance, that's likely not to be enough, and that some belt tightening and using less water is going to be necessary. And that really, for agriculture, mainly means cutting way back on intensively irrigated agriculture. So we raised in that analysis the really looming challenges and threats from that big land use change, not only to the economy of the region and including revenues, job losses, GDP, but also the risks from unmanaged fallow in terms of dust, in terms of pests, in terms of weeds, kind of making it harder for the rest of agriculture to continue well, but also really raising public health risks for a region where communities are already facing poor air quality. So we also recognize that there were some potential opportunities here if folks could kind of scope things out and collaborate on it. And we listed some of them, low water cropping, solar, habitat, recharge. And we also kind of highlighted the need for cooperative approaches on this. And this was something that, even though folks were, this is early days for SGMA implementation, folks were still in a place where they were, had not finished their initial plans or anything. They could really agree across a lot of the different stakeholder groups that we were working with at that time that they didn't want to see haphazard solutions to this, that they really felt like it was going to be important for folks to look and work together on it. So next slide, Katie. So then came the opportunity to look at a way of digging deeper on this through the SGC program. And so we put in a proposal, and the project goal was really to take things from where we had kind of left them with that last work of looking to advance cooperative strategies to manage these formerly irrigated lands for the greatest benefit. And what we proposed was looking at how to fill some research knowledge gaps on, both sort of things like how big is the dust risk, and what are some ways to mitigate it, but also what are some of the promising low water land use alternatives that might be available. And then a whole set of questions around how can we fund this? What are the opportunities there? What are some institutional and regulatory issues and designs that people should be thinking about for this? And a key part of the goal was to build a shared understanding with a wide group of stakeholders who are going to be effective to doing this work on the ground, and really a key to effective and equitable transitions. We had already been working with a pretty broad group of stakeholder advisors. So our intention was to kind of build on that and expand it, and especially in working with the Central Valley Community Foundation, because they had their whole network of folks that branched into some other areas than where we'd already been working, and also with the Fresno State partners. And the commitment was to produce a number of reports and blog posts, but also to host some events along the way, workshops and advisory group meetings, to just really work with stakeholders in a focused way, but then also some public events to bring the results out to the broader community. And I mentioned already about the SGC funds helping to leverage that. I just want to point to you this donut here. That was sort of the state of knowledge at the point about potential uses of the formerly irrigated lands when we started this project. We had estimated that at least about that many acres would be coming out of intensively irrigated production, and we had a pretty good sense at that point that solar could potentially take up a decent chunk of that, based on some TNC work that had just come out. And then the blue and the orange are different kinds of habitat. In some cases, intermittent wetlands, that piece can double as sort of recharge areas as well. And then there was this chunk of land in gold there that we just called other idle land, where we thought we're not really sure what could even go there. And that kind of led to this question of, okay, is there a potential for dry land or low water cropping to replace more intensively irrigated agriculture? So, okay, next slide. And I just wanted to speak also, since this work is very, front and center, related to the state's climate goals, and that's, a key role of this funding call for from the SGC, that this project kind of in some ways checked all of the different boxes in terms of the different ways in which the SGC was looking at these goals and the broader funding program. So on the climate adaptation side, one really can think of groundwater sustainability and this SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's a major tool for climate adaptation, for adapting to a warmer, more intense droughts and more volatile precipitation. If you don't have your groundwater basin in shape to be able to get through the dry times, it's really not. You're not in good shape to manage your economy and to take care of your communities and your environment. But it's really key how you manage that transition. And there are sort of good adaptations and less favorable adaptations. And we were really interested in, these questions that had come up about how to avoid unintended impacts and to achieve positive outcomes, and particularly thinking about low-income underserved communities, which are make up the bulk of the agricultural labor force in the valley, but also the bulk of a large rural community, rural population that lives outside of the urban areas. That's going to be most subject to dust, for example. On the climate mitigation side, there are also opportunities here to support the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, but also some potential red flags that one has to watch out for in terms of maladaptation again here. And one of the things that was already on the radar was utility scale solar as a major opportunity to meet the state's clean energy goals. But then also, a number of concerns that folks were raising about the role of agriculture and what would happen if you're switching from intensive irrigation to fallow or other land uses. So we wanted to start to take a look at that as well. Okay, next slide. And so, I mentioned that stakeholder engagement throughout this process was really key. We had a stakeholder advisory group that consists of the folks on this list, who met a number of times over the course of the project to give us input. And this list is far from complete in terms of the number of folks that helped participate in the work through a lot of more focused workshops and discussions as well. But it would not have been possible without that really great input, which really improved the content of the work. Okay, next slide. And so this is just a quick overview on what we accomplished. So the project started in late 2020. In 2021, we held our first couple of advisory group meetings, and we launched the work on looking at air quality implications of land fallowing and some of those risks, and also the work on what we were calling dryland cropping systems, which Katie will describe a little bit more to you. But we kind of expanded beyond just purely rain-fed systems to also looking at what happens if you provide a little bit of irrigation. We did some early blog posts on these issues, and I'll just say that our blog posts consisted on this project both of work that we were, our findings, but also a lot of interviews with stakeholders from the Valley on different aspects of the issues. And then in 2022, we continued engagement with the advisory group, and also some additional workshops. We did a workshop on habitat issues. We did 4 workshops on solar energy to do some more deep dive on those issues. And then we published 3 reports, one on land transitions and dust, one on exploring the potential for water limited cropping systems in the Valley, and one on solar energy and groundwater in the Valley. And a lot of blogging, probably practically to, at least once a month, and often more than that. And then this most recent year, 2023, is the wrap up year. We had our first in-person advisory group meeting back in February, actually hybrid, because some folks either had COVID and couldn't join in person, or had gotten comfortable with joining remotely, which facilitated people joining without having to travel as much. A number of focus group meetings as we sort of wrapped up the work, and then 2 reports. The one that looks at our economic analysis of different scenarios for what will happen to the Valley's economy and to jobs and to land fallowing, with different levels of water trading, different types of water trading, as well as different amounts of additional water coming into the Valley. And then a big synthesis report, managing water and farmland transitions in the San Joaquin Valley, that came out in September. And we held a public stakeholder event in Fresno around that, a half-day event in Fresno, which was really great. I should say, back in 2022, we also had a couple of virtual public events on the reports that we released in that year. Some more blogs and commentaries. All along we've kind of also been sending, submitting commentaries that have been running in Valley newspapers, like the Fresno Bee in particular, as well as at the state level. And we've also published some data sets. And with that, I think I'm going to pass the baton over to Katie, who's going to give you an overview of some of the key findings, and then we'll have some time to hear your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, so for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to kind of dive into what we actually found over the last couple of years, delving into each of these different topics. And Ellen already covered a bit of this, but just as a reminder for where we're starting from with these inquiries, as we know, overpumping of groundwater has led to a lot of problems in the San Joaquin Valley in the past decades. And SGMA is a really important piece of legislation for the Valley's future, and including for agriculture. So top of mind for many, bringing new supplies to the Valley. But as Ellen was saying, even with new supplies, we estimated that SGMA was going to require taking land out of irrigated production. Our new modeling with a little bit more spatial resolution in this project allowed us to reaffirm that estimate and kind of refine it a little bit. Talk more about that in a moment. But then as we heard, those lands can pose a risk if they're not managed well. Economic risks, public health risks, and environmental risks. So our goal was to look at what supply and demand tools we have available, what policies we can recommend to help manage those land and water transitions. What are the opportunities and challenges for different land use alternatives, and the funding, incentives, and institutional changes that'll be needed. So just to give you a preview of some of our key takeaways, first, as I said, even with new supplies and bringing more water into the Valley, we found that water trading is going to be crucial for managing increasing water scarcity. Second, if we repurpose farmland in a smart way, that can help avoid some of the worst negative consequences of taking land out of production. And it could also create some opportunity for new benefits to come out of that. Third, people will have to work together. And this includes especially managers from different sectors and across all levels of government. And finally, this will take some money and some reform. So there are existing funding programs that could be expanded to good effect. And we also identified some regulations that should be revisited or updated to ensure that they align with SGMA. All right, so first I want to consider how water scarcity in the Valley will evolve and how that might drive agricultural land fouling. And then I want to look at how water trading as a tool could change that picture in a number of ways. So you can see here 3 maps of the San Joaquin Valley. The map on the left is showing the reduction in available water supplies 2040 from 3 different sources. You can see the primary source of those reductions is pumping cutbacks from SGMA, but then additional reductions come from more stringent environmental flow regulations, as well as from climate change. And that amounts to in total about 20% of current applied water, a 20% reduction in applied water overall. In the middle, you can see basically what folks have today to work with in terms of surface water. And on the right, you can see the distribution of crop types in the valley, perennial versus annual crops. And you can see in the green there that perennials occupy about 60% of the total cropped acreage in the valley. What I want you to notice here is the variation and the heterogeneity throughout the valley, because that's going to really set us up for why trading might be valuable. And Kings Basin, again, is a really good example of that. There are some regions with quite a wealth of surface water and others where the opposite is true. So our new modeling work in this project showed us how water trading and new supplies both could help reduce the cost of transitioning to groundwater sustainability. So in the top left here, we're looking at, this is kind of a different view of those water cutbacks that I showed you in the first map. The black bar on the far left represents our baseline scenario. So all 3 of those reductions are at play, and there's no trading happening. That amounts to about 3 million acre-feet reduction in supplies. And then in the other graphs, you're looking at the economic cost. So you can see again in the black bar, under that first scenario, we see anywhere up to 900,000 acres fallowed, so more than we originally anticipated. Again, this is the worst case scenario. That translates to GDP losses of roughly $4.5 billion annually and roughly 50,000 lost jobs. So again, these are the impacts with those cutbacks, but no trading. Then we modeled 3 scenarios of increasing levels of flexibility in how people can move water around. So the orange bar represents local trading, where people within localities that have pretty similar water availability characteristics can trade groundwater and surface water with their neighbors. Second, the yellow bar is basin-wide trading, where folks can trade surface water and groundwater within a sub-basin. And third, in the green bar here is valley trading, where groundwater still has to stay in the basin, but surface water can move throughout the valley. And you'll see that the ability to move water around doesn't really change the amount of fallowing that we're seeing, but it does have a big effect on the cost of the transition, which decline anywhere from 30 to 50% across those scenarios. And as you might expect, this is also better for jobs. Of course, if you then add new supplies to that, that reduces the economic impacts even further, and it also reduces the amount of fallowing we see. And the same is true when you add increased productivity onto that, increased agricultural productivity. So again, we had some new data available to look at in this project that was much more spatially granular, and that allowed us to look at the distribution of potential fallowing in a much more spatially explicit way. And what you can see here is that on the far left, we have that worst case no trading scenario, and then increasing flexibility as you move from the left to the right on these maps. And basically what trading does is smooths out the risk of fallowing by allowing water to go to its highest value use. So there's been a lot of discussion around water trading under SGMA, and that our project advisors highlighted some popular concerns about the negative consequences. So I would like to just highlight here that we recognize that it's very important to get trading right. And we have an extended discussion on that in our synthesis report, Managing Water and Land Transitions in the San Joaquin Valley. Just some quick takeaways here. But there's some important context to remember. Both groundwater pumping and fallowing can have negative consequences for both water users and communities. So there are some trade-offs that the valley faces in reaching sustainability. By reducing overdraft and attaining sustainability, that's going to address many of those pumping impacts that have caused problems in the past. But it potentially could cause new problems from land fouling. So Ellen was alluding to, it's really important to recognize this context, especially when we're thinking about the impacts of water trading. So we considered a range of potential impacts, from impacts to drinking water to subsidence, and on the fallowing side, the risk of increased dust generation near communities, and the impacts of fallowing on sectors like dairy and farms of different sizes, including smaller farms. The bottom line really is that this is a balancing act. It is important to get trading right, which means paying attention to market rules, avoiding significant impacts, and that could be via no-buy zones, for example, for groundwater in areas with high subsidence risk. But overall, we found that trading can often help to address those impacts and can be helpful even where there are restrictions on the market, like no-buy zones. Market mechanisms can sort of help shift pumping to less vulnerable areas and still allow sellers a way to benefit from their water assets. So a couple of priorities that we wanted to highlight on the water trading topic. The first priority is understanding the scope and the cause of impacts. And then, of course, surface water trading is already relatively common in the valley, but groundwater trading is not. So to establish those new groundwater markets, we'll need new rules and institutions for trading. GSAs have that authority, but they need a couple of things in place to be able to do that well. And that includes strong accounting and monitoring systems. They have to have an allocation system in place for this to work. They need transparent trading rules and platforms, guardrails to avoid those undesirable impacts. And finally, we may need to see support for communities and sectors that will be impacted economically, because trading moves water to crops that generate the highest economic returns. Things like alfalfa, other feed crops, for example, they might be losers in that scenario, which would raise costs for the dairy and beef sectors. So when we see effects concentrated in certain communities like that, that's where transitional financial support may be warranted. And there are some precedents for that. For example, in Southern California, exchanges involving Colorado River water is a good example of that. So really quickly here, I mentioned small farms and protective policies for small farms and communities have been a topic of discussion lately. We ran the numbers on this to see basically how big a piece of the pie of sustainable water supplies would be required to ensure supplies for those groups. The good news is we found that preferential allocations for small communities in the valley would be a barely noticeable share of sustainable supplies. For small farms, we found that the size cutoff matters a great deal. So it's probably wise to think more about groups of special concern within the small farm community rather than blanket policies that are based on acreage. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to turn to the land use alternatives that Ellen mentioned and farmland repurposing in general. As mentioned, we explored a number of different options for keeping lands productive with less water, and we really wanted to emphasize those options that had the potential to bring multiple benefits, not just solitary benefits. And so these new land uses would require something that can be long-term, something that can be self-sustaining, and they would need to deliver on a couple of things. They would need to control nuisances like dust and pests and weeds. They would ideally provide some revenue or other local benefits for communities. And they would need to do all of that with an eye toward being cost-effective to the extent possible and self-sustaining to the extent possible. And I'll delve into some of the opportunities and challenges for each of those land use alternatives on the next few slides. So first, as Ellen mentioned, solar was one that we were well aware going into this project. There was a lot of interest in this and a lot of potential for this. And there's potentially a lot of alignment between the land and water planning processes going on with SGMA and the energy planning processes going on at the state level as well. As you can see from the map, from a sunshine perspective, most of the valley floor is actually suitable for solar. Of course, not all that land is going to end up in solar. And even with the ambitious state goals that we have for renewable electricity, projections suggest that only somewhere between 135 to 215,000 acres might be needed for siting solar in the valley. What this suggests is there might be some flexibility to jointly decide where solar emerges in the future. And this is only going to be enhanced if farmers are able to move their water around. So solar it tends to be an attractive option because it can provide revenues for landowners and counties. It's basically an excuse for continued land management to control those nuisances that I mentioned, and it's a job opportunity creator. There's potentially a large pipeline of construction jobs into the future, even though an existing development doesn't require a lot of labor. The number one bottleneck for this alternative is going to be transmission to get power out of the valley. And beyond that, workforce development is going to be a key priority. Another option that we discussed and explored in depth was water limited cropping to keep some lands in agricultural production. Again, much of the valley floor is potentially suitable for this type of production system. And we're talking winter forages, small grains, things like wheat, barley, oats, that type of thing. But what we found is that having the ability to supplementally irrigate those winter crops with a few inches of water may be a really key factor in where this land use ultimately emerges. In our discussions with growers, in our crop modeling, we found that pure dry land growing crops with only precipitation is probably too risky for the valley. But I will note that we were modeling this based on the idea that water limited crops could be production oriented, yielding enough to at least break even, cover your costs. But your primary objective may not be a marketable product, and you could do a lot less with much less biomass than what we're modeling here. Things like strip cropping for dust mitigation, cover crops, opportunistic grazing. Either way, the idea with this land use alternative is that with just a little bit of water, much less water than usual, you could maintain the opportunity to earn income on that land, cover some of the costs of ongoing land management, and these kinds of systems can be flexibly integrated with irrigated ag and with on-farm recharge. So we do need some more research on varieties of crops that are suited for valley production under these kind of circumstances. And we'll also need available water that folks are willing to dedicate to this, even just a couple of inches. So those are going to be key constraints. A couple of notes on the potential for upland habitat restoration. The map is showing areas that are most attractive for conservation of upland habitat or restoration of upland habitat, particularly because of their adjacency to existing conservation areas. All in all, this is about 1.1 million acres on currently irrigated croplands. So conserving some of these lands can definitely mitigate historic habitat loss that we've seen in the valley, and because it's upland habitat, it requires very little water. There are a lot of challenges for this land use. Success here is going to depend on reducing costs, on finding who's going to manage the potential nuisances that might arise, and establishing some protection for landowners and neighbors to these restoration areas. Finally, real quickly, I'll mention recharge basins. The valley has about 50,000 acres of dedicated recharge basins currently, and these have the opportunity to provide some habitat and help facilitate bringing in new supplies. However, dedicated basins, as they currently are, typically aren't managed for habitat. So there's an opportunity to do more of that and have these be multi-benefit pieces of infrastructure. That said, flooding farmland is likely to emerge as a less costly recharge alternative in the future. It also requires fewer legal protections. So we estimate that there may be a small scope for this land use, maybe 20 to 40,000 more acres of basins So not a lot of land, but it could be important for supplies locally. And finally, new housing development. This is another relatively small new land use, something again that could be important locally. The key here that is if this development happens on current farmland, it uses much less water on a per acre basis. And we did some estimates in past work that said there might be 50,000 acres of new development potential in the valley, and that could save up to 175,000 acre feet of water per year. So that was the whirlwind overview of land use alternatives and water trading. So I just want to do an overview of the recommendations that emerged from this work, is how we actually, what we need to do to actually get to sustainable water and land use in the valley. First, there's the need to strengthen coordination across basins and sectors. SGMA has spurred a lot of new partnerships, but up to now, a lot of the focus has been on planning within the jurisdiction of a GSA. For things like supply augmentation, recharge, and trading, you'll need partnerships across neighboring basins. And for land repurposing, you need coordination across the valley, both to find the best sites of least conflict, and to find opportunities to consolidate land management, and maybe capitalize on some economies of scale there. So I'll just call out the SJV CAP and the blueprint, which are examples of some homegrown regional efforts that the state can help support. And basically the state federal role in general here is to incentivize and support that coordination. Second, water infrastructure and energy transmission are going to be key investments. On the water side, you'll need conveyance for recharge and trading. That's where local and regional water agencies, DWR, the Bureau of Reclamation are going to be important, because right now conveyance is a limiting factor in getting water to the best places for recharge. On the energy side, collaboration between the state and locals is going to be key, because power grid expansion is complex, very time consuming. So we may need to see some fairly unprecedented cooperation among state energy planning and regulatory agencies, utilities, energy developers, and local land use authorities for that matter. Third is to promote effective and responsible water trading. And I already discussed a lot of the important parts of trading here, but essentially we need to do what we can to establish robust local groundwater markets and rules, for which getting local buy-in is going to be very important. We'll also need to improve the flexibility of surface water markets and consider transitional support where that may be warranted. Next is to ramp up research and development on water-limited cropping systems. Winter crops irrigated at a significant deficit could occupy a lot of acreage that would otherwise be fallowed, and that would bring both economic and environmental benefits. So we don't know, these are familiar crops in California, wheat, triticale, barley, but we don't know much about growing them under water-limited conditions in the San Joaquin Valley. So we'll need to work on breeding and genetic resources, develop good varieties that are good for forage, that do well under water stress. We'll need to dial in management approaches and also understand consumer demand and market dynamics for these kind of crops. And then finally, an important piece of this is understanding how we account for returns to water when we're using water on these kinds of crops. That might be important in a world where water is expensive and it's a scarce commodity. Next is seeking some alignment between regulatory and fiscal incentives with SGMA. So SGMA was adopted in 2014, but many of the relevant regulations and tax policies were set up long before that. So that includes things like dust management regulations, urbaning issues, Williamson Act contracts and how those are interpreted. And we concluded that many of those should probably be revisited or at least updated for a future SGMA. We have a long list of issues that we think merit attention, including rules about dust, legal assurances for habitat conversion, reevaluating or relaxing certain CEQA requirements, and adapting Williamson Act rules, among others. And I would direct you to the report to learn more of the details on that. And then finally, it's important to note that local, state, and federal parties all have a role to play here. The state and federal agencies have some existing programs that would be great to expand, but the locals will need to develop some funding as well, especially for GSA projects and actions. So some examples of that could include incentives for strategic land fallowing, well mitigation programs, local recharge, and funding habitat restoration. Some examples of from the state side could include support for SIGMA implementation, GSA capacity building, support for farmland repurposing, and we've seen a bit of that. The multi-benefit land repurposing program and land effects program are good examples of that. And then from the federal side, there are, of course, core programs already exist that support activities relevant for meeting SIGMA goals, including some NRCS programs. Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program is another thing that California could perhaps engage more with on the USDA side. So these are just a couple of examples. So I want to wrap up on a positive note. We believe that there is a future for agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley, and improved groundwater conditions are only going to support this. If we come up with the right incentives, the right institutions, and we have the right coordination, we can avoid the worst impacts of the land transition for landowners and communities. And if we're successful at that, that not only benefits the valley, but it also brings statewide benefits in terms of renewable energy and habitat and other things. So I want to take a step back now and bring us back to the SGC project and what we learned throughout the last couple of years. There were some challenges, but also many opportunities that came out of this work as well. The pivot to digital that Ellen mentioned was one big challenge. This project was conceptualized with a very strong outreach and engagement component. And so the pivot to digital was a bit jarring in that respect, but it also made reaching some audiences easier, eliminating that travel burden and so forth. And it allowed us to tap and draw from a broader geography to get insights. But of course, it does make it more difficult to have those impromptu conversations and make those connections. We were able to return to in-person format for the final year of the project, including the event in Fresno that I mentioned. And this was appreciated, I think, by the stakeholder community and provided an opportunity for those of us who we hadn't heard before in the virtual space to participate. Then there's the weather, which actually was something of an opportunity for us. The 2020 to 22 drought, of course, was going on during the bulk of this project. And it's quite likely that this actually brought more people to the table and heightened some interest in this topic because the urgency of the situation was much more visible. And the reality of the drought impacts drove home the need to adapt Valley Ag to continued water scarcity. Of course, we had a reversal in those fortunes this past year. And while that rain was definitely a welcome relief and also allowed us to make a lot of progress across the valley on recharge, there's a need to continue that focus on the dry years to come, including implemented those needed land use transitions and demand management. Another opportunity was some of the new projects, the new programs that I just mentioned. The attention that this project drew to the question of land repurposing particularly played a role in the development of some new state programs to pilot and fund collaborative repurposing efforts. So I'm thinking of the Land Flex program that DWR brought on and the multi-benefit land repurposing program at the DOC. And we found the timing of this to be very fruitful on all sides. We could share what we were learning to inform program structure, and we also could get feedback from program developers in real time. So that was a great example of co-creation of knowledge and knowledge sharing there to really create some impact. And I just wanted to let you know that I've provided links to all of these resources in the slides, which will be available to you after this presentation. So links to all the reports, as well as some selected blogs and commentaries that came out of this project, and a couple of important data sets. With that, I'll say thank you and open up the floor.